Awesome. And we're live. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody who's tuning in. Um, Thank you for being here. We are having another workshop for the Infinite Space Bazaar, and today we'll be learning about Arbitrum Orbit with Celestia underneath. Today we have Diego from the Celestia Labs team, and he'll be going through how he built the integration and what you can do with it. So, Diego, if you want to introduce yourself, you can go ahead.
Uh, yeah, absolutely. GM, everyone. Like Josh mentioned, my name is Diego. I'm a solutions engineer at Celestia Labs, working mainly on integrations. More specifically, I work on L2 integrations, right? So like the rollup stacks that you usually associate with like Ethereum L2s. And today, more specifically, we're going to talk about the Arbitrum Nitro stack, more specifically Arbitrum Orbit, right? Like what does that encompass, and how does that stack with Celestia underneath like kind of works, right? We're not going to go too deep into the weeds, but we're going to try to give you a good overview of kind of like what's going on, so you understand what you're dealing with, and then we'll get into like a quick demo of like how easy it is to deploy your own Arbitrum Orbit rollup with Celestia underneath in like around 15 minutes. And yeah, so I guess like let's get started. Let me see
I'll let
how.
you take it away.
Awesome.
If you do have questions for Diego during the talk, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them towards the end.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So introduction to Arbitrum Orbit with Celestia underneath, right? If you ever looked at the Arbitrum Nitro repo, their tagline is Nitro goes vroom vroom and fixes everything. So that's why I picked the little race car emoji with the dust and the Celestia underneath sparkles, because we're about to give you a really fast, in my opinion, overview of like what is Nitro, what is the Arbitrum stack, right, and how does Celestia underneath like come in and make DH fees cheaper, but also makes the stack still verifiable and secure, right? So this is like probably the I would like to say 10th or so presentation in ISV. Um, you probably already heard about what Celestia is, so I'm not going to do like a deep dive on what Celestia is, but just to put it on the top of our heads, right? Celestia is the first modular data availability network that securely scales to the number of users. This is thanks to like data availability sampling. More on that later. We can talk about that during the Q&A time. But basically, the more people run light nodes, the more people are sampling the network, the bigger we can make the blocks without sacrificing the hardware requirements, right, to verify the network. What is blob stream? You're going to hear me say blob stream multiple times during this presentation, right? So might as well define it now. Blob stream is a data attestation bridge between Celestia and any EVM chain. Currently, it's live on Arbitrum 1 as well as Base, and it's also on testnets, right? Like Arbitrum 1 Sepolia and Base Sepolia. And more specifically, the version that's live is Blobstream X, which is a parentheses CK version of Blobstream, right? So it's the same concept of a data attestation one-way bridge between Celestia and an EVM chain. But instead of doing it in, I guess, like, let's call it the naive or the simple way of like verifying the validator signatures in a smart contract, which obviously becomes very gas intensive and expensive, we use CK, right? We use a snark proof to verify Celestia's consensus. This was done by the folks at Succinct Labs. Shout out to them for their amazing work. And now, what is Arbitrum Orbit? There's like multiple definitions around the Arbitrum docs, right? So I kind of just picked this one from the website of Arbitrum Orbit, which is really cool. But basically, Arbitrum Orbit is like the permissionless path for launching a dedicated chain using the Arbitrum technology, right? So Arbitrum Orbit in and of itself is not like a its own tech stack. It's not necessarily its own like thing, like library or repo, but it's more of a concept, right? So it's in the same way that other L2s have their own like stack, right? Orbit is like a way to refer to the way in which you can use the Arbitrum tech stack to deploy your own chain, right? Now, what is this Arbitrum technology, right? I'm not going to give you a deep dive into each one of these, right? Otherwise, that would take too long. But we're going to do like a brief introduction into like what you're getting into. What is this Arbitrum tech stack? Like why choose Orbit? Why choose the Arbitrum tech stack, right? So first of all, Nitro, right? So Nitro is a fully integrated, complete L2 optimistic rollup system. That just means it's a ORU, right? Optimistic rollup. It actually has fraud proofs. They're live. They've been live since inception around 2 years ago. And it has everything else that you would need to essentially build a rollup, right? It has sequencing. It has the token bridge contracts. It has it also has advanced data compression. It has a bunch of other cool little features, right? That are meant to make it essentially as good as possible. And then there's other things, right, in the Arbitrum tech stack. Stylus, you may or may not have heard of this. It's essentially an upgrade that will be added to the Arbitrum Nitro like repo, right? So Arbitrum Nitro is the software, both the combination of like the rollup node and sequencing stack, as well as the contracts that make an optimistic rollup using the Arbitrum tech stack possible. And Stylus is essentially a upgrade, if you will, to the virtual machine or the execution environment of Arbitrum Nitro, right? So it's an upgrade that adds a second co-equal VM to the EVM. What that means is that we're not replacing the EVM. We're actually adding a second virtual machine that you could use in tandem with the EVM in your rollup. And this allows you to write programs in Rust, C++, and more while still preserving the EVM, right? So that's why they call this the EVM plus, right? You're not giving away what you're used to. You're not giving away EVM tooling and languages, but now you're also gaining a secondary VM through the Stylus upgrade that allows you to write your contracts, right, using essentially any language that compiles down to WASM. And the cool thing here, right, is that it has a lot of like improvements on how to essentially make like execution. I don't want to necessarily say more performant, but let's say more efficient, right? Like Stylus can accomplish a given task in less opcodes in the Arbitrum machine than it would take Solidity, right? Since under the hood, what's happening is that you have the EVM, which compiles down to like Arbitrum WASM, and now you have Stylus, which allows you to compile these like Rust and C++ programs, etc., into Arbitrum WASM, right? So it's more efficient, it's cool, it lets you do all these crazy things. We can talk more about this later. But here's like a cool little diagram from the Nitro, from the Arbitrum docs, more specifically on Stylus, right? And it shows you what the idea is of like having the EVM, right? That's what like Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova and basically any Orbit chain nowadays has, right? It's just an EVM rollup with fraud proofs and some advanced techniques that a rollup user usually doesn't really even see or notice. And then here's the EVM plus, right? It's what we just talked about. It allows you to do all this cool stuff, right? And last but not least, there's Bold, right? So Bold, or bounded liquidity delay, is a dispute protocol that enables permissionless validation for Arbitrum chains, right? Now, what does that mean, right? So currently, if you deploy even before we talk about deploying an Orbit chain, right? If you look at the current Arbitrum tech stack rollups, right, like Arbitrum 1, they have a limited set of validators, right? essentially validators are whitelisted, right? You can't join, you can't try to validate the chain if you're not whitelisted, right? Obviously, that's not great because it's not fully permissionless. But that is essentially getting sold by Bolt, which the code is like live on GitHub. You can go check it out. And this is what will allow not just Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova, but also any Orbit chain to have permissionless fraud proofs, right? Now, let's just try to like pack everything that I just talked about into like a nice little sentence, right? So how does Orbit relate to the Arbitrum's tech stack, right? So an Orbit chain uses Nitro, right? The rollup software stack, but it also benefits from all these upcoming upgrades like Stylus and Bold, plus the already existing tooling in the ecosystem, right? What that means is that if you launch an Orbit chain today, with or without Celestia underneath, you're not locked into your current status quo, right? Like the day Stylus becomes available and merge into Nitro, right? Soon after, it will become available to Orbit chains, including ones that have Celestia underneath, right? Same thing with Bolt. It's part of the kind of like workflow and overall integration, because ultimately, as we're gonna unpack in a bit, adding DA to something like Nitro doesn't necessarily change, right? A bunch of other stuff in the tech stack and the code, and it allows us to essentially be ready for when these upgrades come along to the Arbitrum tech stack, right? Now let's talk about Arbitrum Orbit, right, with Celestia underneath, right? So Orbit with Celestia underneath is the first quote-unquote alt-DA to have working fraud proofs in the Nitro stack. What I mean by that is Arbitrum, or more specifically Nitro, right, has fraud proofs, and so far it only works with like the vanilla rollup mode that posts data to Ethereum or to the underlying L1 or the underlying layer, right? Because an Orbit chain can be an L3, so it would post to an L2. And then there's AnyTrust, right? So AnyTrust already had or has working fraud proofs, right? But Celestia now joins this family of like DA options in the Nitro stack that have working fraud proofs, right? So there's no cutting corners here, right? There's no funky stuff going on. Using Celestia DA with Orbit doesn't mean you have to give up the same security, right? The same fraud proof system that has been securing Nitro for such a long time, right? You get to keep all the goodies from the Arbitrum stack, right? Like I mentioned, you get to keep future compatibility with Stylus. You get to keep future compatibility with Bold. You get to use all these like libraries and things that the Arbitrum ecosystem has, right? That also libraries that the Off-Chain Labs team has built around like monitoring your chain, right? Like token bridge UIs, etc. Right? You don't have to rebuild everything. And last but not least, right? In my opinion, the most important thing here is like you have secure DA thanks to Blobstream and data availability sampling. Without that, right, the fraud proofs wouldn't be secure. So it's really important to note that, right? And yeah, so what exactly does it look like to modify Arbitrum Nitro and add Celestia DA, right? We talk a lot about integrations and supporting Celestia DA for different L2 stacks, right? But people don't realize like that on the big picture, it's actually quite simple, right? So here is a picture from the Nitro docs on essentially what is a Nitro chain, right? So if we look at this diagram, right, starting all the way from the top left, a Nitro chain essentially just takes user transactions, right? There's a sequencer out there, and the sequencer takes all these user transactions and makes them into an order list, right, of sequence transactions, right? The sequencer gives you this like soft guarantee of finality, right? That's why if you interact with Arbitrum 1 using MetaMask or whatever, you don't have to wait for the rollup to post a batch of data to Ethereum for it to be finalized, right? It gives you a soft guarantee that your transaction will be included. So it, that's what gives you like this like good UX on when using a rollup, right? You don't have to wait ages for the transaction to be included. It's included. The sequencer gives you a soft guarantee. You move on, and then once that sequence of transactions gets essentially built by the sequencer, right? There's two things that happen in this diagram, right? One of them is you take that entire batch of data that forms the sequence transactions, and you compress them using a compression algorithm called Broadly, and you post them to your L1 chain, right? The L1 chain in this case being Ethereum, right, for Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova. But this L1 chain or underlying chain could be an L2, right? If you're building an L3, you're posting to Arbitrum 1, right, for example. And on the other side of this diagram, right, sequence transactions get passed one by one according to the order of the sequence through the state transition function. And then the state is updated accordingly. It creates an L2 block, and then those L2 blocks are settled on the L1, right? Now, this is what it looks like for a Nitro rollup, right? So what does it look like to add Celestia D8? It's this simple, really. Like from a big picture, right? If you're a rollup developer, or you're more specifically someone who is looking to deploy an app as your own rollup, right? And you want to use Celestia for D8, you don't have to be scared that this is like some complicated series of changes that is going to entirely affect the way the stack works. It's as simple as taking the batch, the compressed batch of data, posting it to Celestia, right? In the case you are unable to post to Celestia, right? We have this thing called fallback. We didn't build it. Actually, the Arbitrum Nitro stack already has it for AnyTrust. So we take advantage of that. So in the case that, say, the batch poster is unable to post to Celestia because let's come up with some scenarios, right? Like it ran out of funds, it got disconnected from the internet, something happened. Who knows? Then instead of posting the batch to Celestia, it would be posted back to your underlying L1, right? In the case it is posted to Celestia successfully, right? You had no problem with your connection to your node. You had no other issue whatsoever. And Celestia's running live as expected, right? Then the data gets posted, and then what the batch poster does is essentially post a data pointer to the L1 chain, right? This essentially allows people looking at the inbox sequencer contract on the L1 to look at it and then see for a given batch number where does that data live on Celestia, right? So the footprint of what we're posting to your settlement layer is like really small. It's essentially the height the height of the Celestia block and the blob commitment for which you posted your data, and additionally a data route that corresponds to the header of the Celestia height that you're posting to, which is then used to verify that the data was included in Blobstream or not. So that last part, what that really means is that in the case that somebody wants to initiate a challenge, right? Before you can get into the challenge, right, you have to prove that the data for a given batch was even posted, that it's been made available. And what provers would do is essentially take these like proofs of inclusion and verify them against Blobstream. In the case that verification is not successful, then we discard the batch, right? Because either data was not made available for some unknown reason, or the batch poster tried lying about the nature of the location of the data in some way, shape, or form. But other than that, right, as you can see from these two slides, it's very simple. We're not changing the EVM here. We're not changing the way Arbitrum does things. We're just adding an option for you to essentially be able to post your data to, right? Reduce your DA fees, but more importantly, without having to sacrifice, right, cheap fees and security at the same time, right? So you're getting the, like, in my opinion, right, bias, but whatever, best of both worlds, right? You're not just gaining cheaper DA fees, you're also gaining a stack that's been shown to be performant for the past couple of years, and you're getting a DA layer, right, and an integration that has working fraud proofs, that has data availability sampling, that has Blockstream, right, that has this like data attestation bridge. Now, using Blockstream, right, like I mentioned, using Blockstream gives us an on-chain way to verify whether some data was posted to Celestia or not, right? This is then leveraged in the Nitro smart contracts to see if a batch of data was posted to Celestia or not. This is true of pretty much like every kind of rollup, not necessarily just Arbitrum Orbit, right? So that's the cool thing about Blockstream. We can deploy it on Ethereum L1, right? You can deploy it on whatever L2 you want. You can deploy it on whatever EVM chain you want if you want to make a rollup on top of that EVM chain. And now you have a way to essentially verify whether some data was posted to Celestia or not, and then act accordingly in your rollup protocol rules, right? This is a diagram from the Celestia docs that shows you what the overall interaction and flow between the Blockstream X contract that, as I mentioned, is currently live on Arbitrum 1 and Base, and how that interacts with the Celestia network, how that interacts with the succinct prover network, and how rollups interact with all of that, right? So as you can see in the diagram, what happens is that rollups verify that data was posted to Celestia, right, in order to gain security from it. All that interaction happens with the Blockstream X contract, and at the same time, the rollups post their data to Celestia, and then these like Blockstream X proofs from Celestia consensus data get ingested, right, by the succinct prover network, which then verifies these Blockstream X proofs, goes through a succinct gateway contract, and then it updates the state of the Blockstream X like client contract on your chain. And that's basically the end-to-end flow for what happens when, say, you post a transaction to a rollup that uses Celestia DA and Blockstream, all the way back to how that gets verified, right? Now, why Celestia DA? Specifically in this case of like using Arbitrum Orbit, it's the only solution that has working Nitro fraud proofs, as we mentioned before. It's the only solution that has data availability sampling that's live today. And it's the only solution currently that has slashing thanks to data availability sampling. Now, what does that mean? It means you use the same fraud proof system that has kept Arbitrum chain secure for the past like 2 years. It means that Celestia validators can be held accountable for their faults, right? Unlike in systems without slashing, which means that all this equals working fraud proofs systems equals working validating bridge equals you can trust when you interact with these like bridge UIs, right, and with Orbit chains with Celestia underneath, right, that this is being validated, right? That not only is this using, like I mentioned, the fraud proofs from the Nitro stack, but it's also using Celestia DA, right, which availability is being verified by data availability sampling like clients, right? And additionally, you can also trust, right, that Blockstream is integrated into this rollup stack, right? So basically, you get the highest trust assumptions that you can get from this sort of construction, right? From Optimiums with Celestia DA, for lack of a better word or terminology. And yeah, I mean, this is basically me, right, giving you a good reason to go and try out the Orbit with Celestia underneath stack, right, or integration. And with all of that said, right, with that overview done, let's get into deploying a chain, right? Let's go to Orbit together. If you want and you have um, Arbitrum Sepolia ETH available, then you can follow along. If not, you can wait after this because you do need to have testnet ETH on Arbitrum Sepolia 1 to essentially do this tutorial. You can also do base Sepolia, but for the purpose of this presentation today, we're going to go ahead and do Arbitrum 1 Sepolia. So now let me share my screen for the Arbitrum Orbit deployment UI for chains with Celestia underneath. This is a modified version of the already existing Arbitrum Orbit deployment UI. Shout out to the Off-Chain Labs teams because they built this UI essentially, right? Like the original one, all I did was take it and use whatever little front-end skills I have to modify the background and add the correct typings and map into the contracts that Orbit chains with Celestia underneath use for communicating with Blockstream, right? So let's go ahead and connect to the website. All right, so once you have your Arbitrum Sepolia ETH, right, or your base Sepolia ETH, you can choose either or, right? You go ahead and you click deploy Orbit chain. Really doesn't get easier than that. The next screen, right, allows you to choose your DA solution. In the vanilla, or let's just call the OG Arbitrum 1 deployment UI, it only gives you the option to deploy a rollup or to deploy an antitrust chain, right? So that's why we have a modified version, because until the integration is fully upstream into Nitro, right, it's kind of hard to coordinate across all these different repos and stuff. So for convenience, right, we just have this like modified UI, like I mentioned, that's not just like Celestified, right? But it also allows you to pick a Celestia DA, right, as your DA layer. So here we're picking Celestia DA through Blockstream, right? Then you pick next, and now this page allows you to configure your chain, right? You can pick your chain ID, right? Be wise about that. Don't pick an already existing chain ID or suffer the consequences. You can pick a chain name, and then there's also other modifications that you can do. So you can modify the challenge period blocks. If you don't understand what that means, you can just use the default. That's probably best. You can also change the base stake needed for validators on the network. You can, pick the owner. You can add validators, right? So for this run, we're only going to have one validator. For testnet, that's like fine, right? If you're deploying one of these things on mainnet, please don't have only one validator. That's not good. And then you can also pick or modify the batch poster address, right? And this gives you, this on the side gives you a quick little description of what each of these values is and what it does, right? But today we're just gonna basically go with the defaults, and we'll modify the chain name. But before that, the other thing to mention is that you can pick a custom token, custom gas token. So you don't have to use ETH as a gas token. You can use your own custom token for gas. Do take into account that for this to happen, your custom gas token needs to exist on the settlement layer. That means if you're deploying an Orbit with Celestia DA chain on top of Arbitrum 1, and you want to use your own token that you created for gas, that token needs to exist on Arbitrum 1, right? It can't just like pick it up from nowhere. It can't just create it into existence. It has to be like already, it has to already exist, right? Or be ported over or bridged to Arbitrum 1. But anyways, let's move on. Chain name, let's do something like ISB Orbit, right? I know, very original. Don't judge me for that. Now you'll click deploy. The screen share won't show it, but this will pop up MetaMask, right? It will ask you for some of your Sepolia ETH. And obviously you want to confirm if you want to move on. And that will send a transaction to Arbitrum Sepolia, essentially deploying the necessary contracts for your rollup stack. And that will then take you to the next page. Now, this page shows you essentially your rollup configuration, right? It shows you your L3 configuration, and it also gives you access to the addresses for your validators and batch poster, as well as the addresses for your contracts, right? Now, what that means, right, is that if you want to go check it out, you can go click on it, right? You can see freshly created contract. There's nothing here. I don't know if it verifies them for you. I think it does not. That's a task that you would have to do, I believe. But let's not worry about that. The next step is to download these like zip files, right? So you want to essentially take your Orbit config zip files, right? This is very important. And then you will move on to the next step. The next step finally is step number 4, which is to deploy your chain locally. And if you give me a second, what I will do is launch my light node real quick, and then I will share my screen and show you how to follow along these like steps. Yeah, I will show you. I will show you what happens once you have all this set up. I will most definitely not show you step number 3, even though it's a dummy account. I am not giving you all my private key. So here, I think you meant the previous page. We'll look at that in a second. Let me fetch the right stuff. So I'll get that, and then we will fire up the Celestia Light node. All right, so let me now present. Let's see. Okay, so now we're running a light node, right? This is against Mocha. And this is probably kind of small. Let me zoom in so people can see it, right? So you run a light node, all good. And then you want to make sure that you've cloned the Celestia.org setup script. Which essentially has everything wired up so that you can follow along this tutorial. And what you want to do, if you haven't already, is you want to do yarn install. I believe you need to use node 18.17 or some version higher than 18.0. So I'm just going to go with 18.0, and we'll do yarn install. While that's working, the next step is to have Docker running. You want to have Docker engine running in whatever machine you're using, right? You want to be able to launch containers, right? Without that, this will not work. And then what you want to do before you even get to that is actually to go here, and for your config, right, you can actually, this is some old config that I have. It's not able to delete it. Interesting. One second. Technical difficulty. How did that file get into my system that I do not have permission to delete? That is beyond me. So give me 1 second while I get rid of that. We will get rid of that file real quick. Okay, so we've gotten, okay, that's awkward. And I think now I should be able to just move that to trash and we good. And then what we're gonna do is take our node config and our Orbit setup script config. That comes from the zip file that you downloaded on step 3. You open that zip file, and then all you have to do is drop it in your config folder inside of Orbit setup script. Give me a second while I do that. Just have to find which one I just downloaded because I have a couple of them. And then we'll show you how to run this. Okay, so we got them here. We'll just move them to config. And then that would work. As you can see, you can use the vanilla parent chain connection that comes with the Orbit setup scripts. In this case, it's just the Sepolia Arbitrum RPC. The scripts do generate some wallets for you. And then last but not least, right, you have the Celestia config or the Celestia CFG that you can use to essentially run your chain. Here you have the Blockstream address on Arbitrum Sepolia 1 or Arbitrum 1 Sepolia, whichever one is correct. And what you want to do here is get your auth token for your Celestia node so that you can put it in your config, right? And that way you can actually talk to your chain. So let me do that real quick. So what you want to do is Celestia Lite auth admin. You want to make sure that you're doing the right network. In this case, we are going to do Mocha. Then that will give you your Celestia auth token. If you try to mess around with me, be advised. I will be changing this. But anyways, you have your auth token. You can set all the defaults to true. You're fine. You don't need anything else. If you are a batch poster, the current version that this is running does require you to have a Alchemy, or sorry, not an Alchemy, a WebSocket connection, which I will not be sharing with you. But I will run it, and then we can see everything in action. So once you have everything together, what you want to do is follow the instructions here. It doesn't get simpler than this. You can just Docker compose, and that should start running your chain, right? Might take a little bit of time. And then the following thing that this would do is, or the following steps would be to take the private key that you use to deploy this rollup, right? So this is for testnet only. Please only use like dummy addresses that don't have any real value, especially if you're in a predicament like me and you're sharing your screen with other people online. Be smart about this, please. You're advised. But basically, once your Docker containers with your sequencer, batch poster, etc., start running, we'll give that some time. You will run this script, which will then like fund the right accounts in the chain, right? It will fund your batch poster, it will fund your validator, etc., etc. And then you can follow along and look at the Docker Compose like logs. And you're gonna have to wait for me for this to run, or well, for the Docker containers to be done doing their thing. Whenever that's ready, and then I will run everything else and show you kind of like what the output is. And then I will attempt a bridge transaction. And finally, because the bridge transaction to bridge out will take a while, we can get into Q&A. Okay, so now we got this. And then we'll do this. And just give me 1 second while I fund my account. Okay. So we'll run. One thing to improve here, I will take this as a valid submission, is to make this so that you don't have to copy paste, so that you don't have to copy paste the private key into the CLI command. That would be great for other people in the future that decide to present on any Arbitrum Orbit stack related stuff. And then give me 1 second while I pull out some stuff out of here. Let's fix this, and then this, and then just give me 1 second. I'm just being precautious and not showing you this private key. So give me 1 second while those logs are like ready. But it is funding the the batch poster account. Let's see. Oh, I see. There was an error with my there's an error with my config. I set up the wrong config. Let me fix that real quick, and should be back in business. In the meantime, I do believe we have 10 minutes left, or 15-ish minutes left. I don't know why it's taking so long during this live stream, but I do have instructions in a Twitter thread. We do have these instructions in the Celestia org docs on how to deploy your own Arbitrum chain. Excuse the technical difficulties. I had not set up the right endpoint, but now I'm rerunning the chain, and I think this must be very boring. I'm sorry, y'all, that I can't show you my screen. I can share this for now. It's running the chain again. I had to fix it, fix the config. I had to rerun the containers. Celestia Light node, nothing new. You've probably seen those already. And once this is done, I will attempt again to run the transaction. As you can see here, I had an issue because I was not using the right URL for one of my endpoints. So now everything should be running. Okay, so should be good to go now. Yes, it's working. So all our containers are working, right? So our chain is running. And then let's see if I can get the funding part done on time. Let's see. So far, so good. You know what? I don't have anything on this account, so I don't care if you use this private key. There's no funds there. It's just testnet. Whatever, just to make this more interesting. So now we've resumed the operation of funding the accounts, right? We're currently running some transactions on the background thanks to the Arbitrum Orbit script, and basically it's taking funds from my testnet account, right, and deploying the right contracts for the token bridge, as well as funding the right accounts for my rollup. And while we do that, what you can do, as shown in the screen, you can actually go here and start logging the output of your Nitro chain. You're likely to encounter a lot of warnings, right? I am using a public RPC. If you use your own RPC for your chain connection, you will be probably like fine. You won't get as many warnings as I do. And while we wait for this to complete, that's basically it. Apologies that it took like longer than expected. Just like impromptu issues with like getting the right like RPC connection set up or whatnot. But once you're done with your with using the Arbitrum Orbit deployment UI, we have this quick little page to guide you to some RAS providers, right? Like Caldera, Conduit, AltLayer, and Gelato. So if you are someone that's building a Orbit chain or are considering building an Orbit chain and you want to use Celestia DA, right? But you don't want to, fail like I failed today to demonstrate how to run this on your command line simply. And you don't want to maintain like, you don't want to do DevOps, which is like a valid excuse. Then you go to a rollup as a service provider. They make it easier than like this UI, right? This UI is like for demonstration purposes. Really, it's a testnet thing. This UI does not work on mainnet, right? But the people that you will be able to talk with once you want to launch an Orbit chain with Celestia DA on mainnet are on this page. And yeah, now let's go back. Here we see that everything has been set up. And that means we are done with this tutorial, right? Like our chain is running. Our accounts have been funded and we are able to go play around with our account, right? You will be able to connect MetaMask or your favorite toolings, right? Like Foundry to your rollup and start deploying contracts, start playing around with it, bridge in, bridge out, etc. And what that does now is we'll go back to the presentation to just finish it up. Things you can build. You can leverage the Orbit stack and the scalable modular DA of Celestia to build your app as its own rollup, right? So if you're already in, you're participating in the Infinite Space Bazaar, right? If you're building a rollup, right, which, in my opinion, you should. Hopefully, you are. You have choices to make as to what rollup stack you can use. And hopefully today, this presentation gave you an idea of what it means to use the Orbit stack, so you can build whatever app idea you already had as a rollup using the Arbitrum Orbit stack with Celestia underneath. And other things you can build is actually you can play around with Stylus. So while Stylus is currently not integrated with Celestia DA, it will be integrated with Nitro soon, and that means you will be able to also soon use Celestia DA and Stylus together. So there's no damage done if you can't demonstrate Stylus running with Celestia DA. But what you can do is still use Stylus, because Stylus is really cool, right? If you go to their docs, they actually teach you how you can add a new smart contract language to Stylus. So if you are a programming language or compilers nerd, shout out all of them that are on Twitter, many of them good friends. You can actually like go ahead and do this. I would take this as a very good and valid submission. You can add a new smart contract language. And additionally, you can use Stylus for, to build cool things, right? Because of better execution, cheaper compute, etc. And Celestia DA underneath soon. You can start experimenting with building generative or compute-heavy AI models, on-chain games, etc., etc., etc. And with that, thank you for your time. Thank you for bearing with me and my not so amazing presentation skills and the hiccups that we had along the way. But, go house whimsical. And if anyone has any questions, more than happy to answer those.
Yeah, thank you for the walkthrough, Diego, and definitely no stress with the few hiccups. I think it's always bound to happen with any kind of live demo. So we do have a few questions in the chat, and I'll go with the first one, and we'll get to the rest in a second. What are the main differences with the OP stack? So between OP stack and Nitro, apart from fraud proofs?
Good questions. So, I know it says apart from fraud proofs, but like a quick thing to note is that the Nitro stack, right, compiles down things to WASM, whereas the OP stack, or the plan for OP stack fraud proofs, is to compile them to things like MIPS and other instruction sets. It's supposed to be more modular, but to get to the actual like part of the question, like what's the difference, right? Like, so they're both EVM rollups. I can't sugarcoat it. I can't change that. But Arbitrum does have stylus. OP stack does not. That is a big difference, right? Like, you can start playing around with stylus, which lets you write contracts in Rust, C++. It lets you add your own language, so it's not bounded by only those two languages. And I mean, additionally, there's a difference of like Arbitrum will have bold, but that's also not that big of a difference because Optimism has permissionless fraud proofs, right, working on testnet. So those are similarities more than anything. But I would say it comes down to Arbitrum using WASM under the hood, thus leading to stylus. That's something that OP stack does not have. And there's like other differences that are not necessarily technical, right? Like regarding licensing and the fees that you paid when deploying a rollup, right? And the freedoms that you have, right? Like when you deploy an OP stack chain, people usually have the super chain in mind, right? With Arbitrum Orbit, there's no concept of a super chain or shared sequencer, and you're free to deploy your chain like wherever the license lets you. And on the technicals, there's like very small differences, but they're ultimately optimistic rollups that use the EVM, so they do have more similarities than they have differences. I think if you want to dive deeper into that, it might be a little bit outdated because it's from like a year ago, I believe. But NorSwap, who used to work at Optimism, has a really good like article on like how they compare, like what are the differences. But
Nice.
yeah, other than that.
Thank you. And we'll get to a few more before time's up. Moncho asked, what are the tools and resources we'd recommend for those who are interested in starting to deploy a rollup? I can answer the first part. I think heading to our docs is a good start. And then also, I'm going to answer 2 in 1 here. Ryan came in a little late. He's wondering if there's a way to test or play around with Orbit without actually deploying or going live. And AltLayer is actually hosting a public testnet, so I'm going to send that in the chat now. And it's called the Nitrogen testnet. And some more questions for Diego. What are the main technical advantages of using Celestia for DA in an Orbit rollup compared to others? So this comparing to using Ethereum for DA, for example.
So comparison-wise, right? Aside from like the technicalities that are dependent on the integration, right? Like I mentioned before, Celestia is currently the only alt DA that has working fraud proofs, but that's probably, hopefully, fingers crossed, not forever, and other people integrate fraud proofs with Arbitrum Nitro before they launch chains with alt DA on mainnet. But the other, like the actual differences, right? Like why pick Celestia DA? I can just say 2 words. One is blob stream, the other one's slashing. So when you're publishing data to Celestia, right, there's no because there's no inherent connection between Blockstream and between Celestia and Ethereum, or Celestia and your L1/settlement layer. You need to have a data attestation bridge, and that's where Blockstream comes in, and it allows you to do on-chain verification that your data was actually published, right? That's a very important thing. I'm not aware of how other DA layers do this, but as an example, Arbitrum Antitrust doesn't necessarily verify inclusion. I think it just takes the signatures of the DAC and runs with it. Whereas we're running like actual proofs and checks. And then second, slashing, right? So because Celestia-like clients run data availability sampling, because there are people running data availability sampling nodes, and because these Orbit chains run like clients under the hood, right? There's people sampling the Celestia headers. There's people that are making sure that the data is available. And if it's not, then they're able to slash the perpetrators through social consensus, right? That's the only way. Social consensus is the only way in which we know you can slash data on availability. Other solutions, they haven't even bothered with it. They don't even have slashing live. So, I mean, take your pick, right? Like, do you rather have security and cheap fees, or do you rather have like no security? That's my opinion. That's like the biggest difference, really. And yeah.
Thank you. Great question and a great answer. The last question we'll get to, and then we're going to be up on time, is what are some common problems we might face during the deployment of this system, and what are the best practices to solve them? Where is the best place to ask or check questions about this?
Common problems you might face during the deployment of the system. So, I mean, I would say you got to make sure if you're going to be running one of these Orbit chains on testnet, you have to account that these things obviously use your testnet ETH. So when you fund your validators, you fund your batch posters, etc., you have to make sure that if you're going to run this for like a day or two, etc., that they're funded so that they don't run out of ETH, like testnet ETH. Otherwise, they stop posting and doing things. And other than that, I mean, like any other common problem that you might encounter would probably be because of some misconfiguration, which we can always help in the Discord chat, right, with things around not just configuring your Nitro chain, but also configuring your light node, etc. And the best place to ask or check about this stuff is both the Celestia docs, but also, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, the Discord chat for the ISP, I would say.
That would be the best place. And on that note, we have a thank you from Sammy. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. And if you're watching it after it's already happened, thank you for watching the recording. If you have any questions, as Diego said, the Discord is a great place to ask those. But yeah, thank you, Diego, for teaching us about Nitro. And we look forward to seeing you all in the Discord and at future workshops.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.